Okay. Taking stock of the evidentiary value movement, where from here? So I want to start with some assumptions that I'm adopting. The first assumption is that all scholars who are contributing to the meta-theoretical discussions that have roiled our discipline since 2011 have good motives. 100% of us are sincerely oriented toward optimizing the evidentiary value of our science. It's easy to forget that, but 100% of us really are trying. And second, there are authentic, healthy disagreements about the optimal means of achieving our consensual goal. And the goal is clear: high-quality science. Everything else is a means. Bobby Spellman, many of you saw this, I'm sure, recently published a short personal future history of Revolution 2.0, where she says that I predict that any good future history of this revolution will not read like a history of a scientific revolution. Instead, it will read like the history of a political revolution. And I think that is the right way to think about it. We're seeing changes in our values, norms, ideas about how to go about our conduct. And what an influential revolution it's been. It's hard to imagine that it's been less than 5 years since Leif and colleagues published that false positive psychology paper. So what launched the revolution? Well, I think the major shot across the bow, most of the people in this room probably know, but many people in psychology don't, is this John Ioannidis paper from 2005 published in PLOS Medicine called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. This was going on for a long time. Psychologists were largely blissfully unaware that this movement had started getting some inroads in the biomedical sciences until Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson published this landmark paper, False Positive Psychology on Undisclosed Flexibility in Data Collection and Analysis Allows Presenting Anything as Significant. And for me, this was the crucial moment when we all started thinking differently about this stuff. I'll say these have been monumentally influential papers. So in a relatively short period of time, the Ioannidis paper has 3,300 and change citations. The Simmons paper has about 1,200 citations. Since 2011, in terms of its early influence, there has never been a paper in psychology influential like this. But the influence is way beyond just the citations. The conversations happening in the corridors of psychology departments and conferences are totally different, or at least largely shifted from where they were in 2011, 2010. And there is a fairly influential belief that our concerns about that the issue of false positives is actually very, very severe. So I'll show you a blog post. This is from one of my favorite social psychologists, somebody I respect immensely. I ran it by him twice that I was going to use his blog in this way here, and he's totally fine with it. But I want to illustrate what I believe to be a sentiment that exists in the field. So things have gone sideways in social psychology, and I'm not sure this is necessarily a recent trend. The rot in my chosen field may have been festering for a very long time. I say this because not a day goes by when I do not hear about one or another of our cherished findings falling under disrepute. You have all heard about the depressingly high number of failed replications, be they one-offs or large-scale coordinated lab attempts. You have also no doubt heard about problems with publication bias, low statistical power, and the widespread use of questionable research practices. Taken individually, none of these might be terribly upsetting. Taken together, they are an unmitigated disaster. And I want to call attention to some of the tenor that I perceive in here. Again, this is somebody I respect immensely. This scholar believes that we have in social psychology festering rot. He also believes that we have an unmitigated disaster on our hands. Like this is, and I don't think this is necessarily how everybody thinks. Probably not, actually. But I don't think this guy is an outlier. This is a very reasonable, sober thinker who's offering these assessments. And so this brings me to the outline of today's talk. The first thing I want to do is ask this question. Does the available evidence warrant the conclusion that the field is festering with rot? Is our field an unmitigated disaster? The second is, we're all empiricists, right? And the third question is, where from here, right? We've learned a lot over the last 5 years, an absolutely immense amount, actually, over the last 5 years. Where should we go to optimize the quality of our science from here? Okay. Let's talk about caricatures. Let's not talk about reality. Let's not talk about real people with real views. Let's talk about caricatures of how some people tend to view other people in the field. So there is the head in the sand ostrich caricature. So these are the people who are totally unwilling to acknowledge any possibility that QRPs and file drawer problems are actually a problem for our field, right? And you see this type of image sometimes. I've seen images of an ostrich, and then the caption is, "I'm looking for those hidden moderators." which is cruel but also hilarious. And then on the other side, we can have another caricature of the people on the other side. So this is Chicken Little. These are people who say, "Oh no, the sky is falling. Everything's totally terrible." And so to put the point on the caricatureness of this point here, the extreme view here is everything is so fundamentally flawed that we can't believe anything that's in our journals, and we might as well wipe the slate clean and start again, right? So you can imagine these, again, caricatures, extremes, but I think there is some value, even though these are obviously caricatures and extreme, of thinking of them as like fringes along which people can vary, right? So some people, you could call them the denialists, right? If we want to, use a caricaturing term, or we could call them the histrionics, right? And you can see that there's variation in terms of where a given scholar might fall in terms of her interpretation of the existing evidence. My belief is that there is a great deal of latitude, if you want to view the existing evidence, for determining where you yourself might fall on such a continuum. So I can't really critique the head in the sand argument, because those people have their heads in the sand and aren't really trying to offer huge arguments about what the state of the field is. But there are a lot of people offering what, again, in a tongue-in-cheek way, we could call the Chicken Little argument, that is looking at the available evidence and saying it is so fundamentally rotten that we should just wipe the whole slate and start with radically new procedures. So there are lots of good pieces of evidence in support of this perspective, or that people who might advocate for something, toward that side of the continuum might believe in. But from my reading, there are three that really stand large as the things that we might talk about. First is this false positive psychology article I mentioned previously. Second is measuring the prevalence of questionable research practices by Leslie John and colleagues. And third is Bryan et al.'s landmark 100 replication study paper. Surely there's many, many more pieces of evidence we could look at, but let's just look at these three and see what they tell us about the state of the field. So first, the false positive psychology paper. So these scholars assert that it is rare and sometimes impractical for researchers to make all of these data analytic decisions beforehand. Rather, it is common and accepted practice for researchers to explore various analytical alternatives, to search for a combination that yields statistical significance, and then to report only what worked. The problem, of course, is that the likelihood of at least one of many analyses producing a false positive finding at the 0.05 level is necessarily greater than 0.05. And I would suggest to you, at the risk of being offensive, that anybody who's willing to disagree with that is an ostrich. All of us must be willing to acknowledge that many of us in the field have played fast and loose with researcher degrees of freedom and p-hacking, and consequently, a nominal alpha of 0.05 has in fact not been 0.05. We have rejected things at the 0.05 level that in fact functionally were not 0.05. So the researchers, Simmons et al., do these interesting analyses in there. One of the things they do is they run these how bad can it be simulations. So these are simulations of common researcher degrees of freedom. They look at 4 of these things. Oh, I have a laser pointer here. So they look at 4 of them. So one is there's 2 dependent variables that correlate at 0.5. You can add 10 more observations per cell and run until you get significance. You can control for gender or the interaction of gender with treatment. You can drop or not drop one of 3 experimental conditions. And you can work through various iterations of these things and then just report what you want to report instead of being transparent. And what these scholars find is that alpha, if you think you have an alpha of 0.05, but you've actually done these 4 things and worked through them in an algorithmic sort of way, your functional alpha is in fact 0.61. And they make a point of saying you're actually more likely to find a false positive than not. There are assumptions lurking in this approach, and the authors themselves have some assumptions. So for example, as high as these estimates are, they may actually be conservative. We did not consider many other degrees of freedom that researchers commonly use. That is for sure true. And it's interesting for me to see here that they may be conservative. So we're talking a little bit about what is the reality out in the world. I see a lot of other assumptions that I haven't heard discussed very much. So here's some that I find to be interesting. Researchers are willing to p-hack regardless of an effect's initial p-value. So this is not the garden of forking paths issue. This is you click the running man in SPSS and that first number pops up. Is there a threshold at which you'd be willing to try to get it down to 0.05 or not? This assumption in this paper is that there's no such threshold. You're just as likely to try to p-hack a 0.5 as a 0.07. A second assumption, researchers are willing to p-hack regardless of any theoretical rationale for doing so, right? It's not even that they're convincing themselves of something, the theoretical rationale is irrelevant. And when p-hacking, researchers tend to use the sort of calculating truth be damned efficiency of an algorithm. Now, most of us aren't actually skilled at running these, certainly in 2010, at running these sorts of algorithm things, so I'm trying to think what that would look like to have a person at a computer running through all possible iterations of this particular p-hack approach with all possible iterations of this other one and all possible iterations of this other one and all possible iterations of this other one, then run 10 more people and run through all possible iterations of this one and so forth. So these are the assumptions that get you to those sorts of estimates. So these are the how bad can it be simulations, but when I read the paper, I hear that there are two different meanings of the phrase, how bad can it be? The first one is, how bad is it in actual practice? That is, what are we doing in the field and what does it mean for p-values? And there is a second meaning. How bad can it be under possibly extreme sorts of assumptions? And so which conclusion should we draw from this paper? I mean, it's up to us, each reader can decide. My intuition is that we really have done a pretty good job with this paper of drawing conclusions about the second one, but when we have conversations about this paper, we typically draw conclusions about the first one, that we feel like this paper tells us what's actually happening in the field. And I don't even think that was the intent of these authors. So do you guys remember this other how bad can it be part? I mean, I think this paper, I mean, Leif is here so we can get the answer, but I think this paper was intended as satire, right? So how bad can it be? A demonstration of chronological rejuvenation? Let's read it. Using the same methods as in study 1, we asked 20 University of Pennsylvania undergraduates to listen to either When I'm 64 by the Beatles or Kalimba. Then, in an ostensibly unrelated task, they indicated their birth date and their father's age. We used father's age to control for variation in baseline age across participants. An ANCOVA revealed the predicted effect. According to their birth dates, people were nearly a year and a half younger after listening to When I'm 64 rather than Kalimba. Now, later in the paper, as you guys know, they actually give the full details. And I mean, they go through all the shenanigans they went through in order to get that effect. So there weren't actually 20 people, there were 34. But the reason why I view this as satire is like this stuff, right? So these are the other things they had they could use as a covariate. Things like how old they felt, how much they would enjoy eating at a diner, the square root of 100, their agreement with computers or complicated machines, their father's age, their mother's age, whether they would take advantage of an early bird special, their political orientation, which of 4 Canadian quarterbacks they believe won an award, and how often they refer to the past as the good old days. So from my read, this is trenchant, brilliant satire. It says, look, these degrees of freedom, the researcher degrees of freedom, a phrase that these authors coined, and p-hacking, these authors coined it in this paper. This is a profoundly trenchant satire saying, seriously, are these the methods that we're gonna allow ourselves to use? Because you could do this. But I never thought this paper was intended to show what people are actually doing, or that the alpha inflation goes to 0.61. I may be wrong, but I never understood that. But there are other sources of information. For example, and these actually start to get at what actual researcher behaviors are. So Leslie John and her colleagues published this very nice paper where they asked 2,000 psychological scientists a number of questions. You know, have you ever engaged in the following behaviors? And then I'm going to give their best estimate of the lifetime prevalence or lifetime incidence of these things. So in a paper, failing to report all of a study's dependent measures, that 78% of people have done that. Deciding whether to collect more data after looking to see whether the results were significant, 72. In a paper, failing to report all the study's conditions, 42. So the first one was 72, this is 42. Stopping data collection earlier than planned because one found the result one had been looking for, 36, right? And a lot of the interpretation is like, you see citations to this paper that pretty much all have the flavor of, holy shit. Like, look at what people are doing. And I think that is a valid interpretation. And yet Fiedler and Schwartz published a paper earlier this month that said, yeah, but some of those items are actually ambiguous. And so they themselves tried to find less ambiguous items. And they also said, why do we care about whether somebody's done something once in her career or hasn't done something once in her career? We care about the frequency with which these things have been done. And they get a very different set of numbers, right? So am I telling you that one of these sets of numbers is right and one is wrong? No, I'm sure they're both wrong in their various ways. I'm saying that we have a lot of interpretational latitude on that ostrich chicken little continuum to generate our beliefs about the field. Finally, estimating the reproducibility of psychological science. This is, I mean, truly all of these are landmark contributions. Landmark contribution by Brian and the Open Science collaboration. And what we see here, so there are some famous findings. The most famous one by far, this was hugely played up in the media, for example, and it's a totally legitimate one, is only 36% of the significant original effects replicated. And that's been pretty troubling. Our field got a pretty big black eye about that. Another one that I think is pretty troubling, that's got a little less famous, is that the replication effect sizes were much smaller than the originals, something on the order of half. But as the authors themselves observed, There is no single standard for evaluating replication success. You can slice and dice these data in dozens, probably hundreds of different ways. And here's some other ones that some of you might have thought of and some of you may not have noticed some of these. For 0 of the 97 significant effects was the replication significant in the opposite direction. 0 significant reversals. 83% of the replications trended in the same direction as the original. Combining the original and replication results led to significant meta-analytic effects 68% of the time. And the one that I find staggering is the initial and replication effect sizes correlated at 0.51. So if we're going to think of any given study as a draw from a distribution of possible findings you might have gotten from a study, it's basically a one-item measure. If you take a one-item measure from 2008 and then put it in a different lab, potentially in a different country, try to replicate as closely as you can, but there's no such thing as a perfect replication, and you take another one-item draw, and those things across time and space and methodological variation correlate at 0.51, there's room to say, wow, like that is high. Who would have thought that it would have been that high? Now, am I saying that? No, because I think basically all this stuff is true. These are all legitimate ways of talking about things. So my interpretation is, if somebody says to you, the field is fine and I'm sick of these activists, we don't have anything to worry about because everything's fine. Or somebody says to you, the field is rotten, we need to wipe it clean because it is a total disaster, that both of those people are telling you more about themselves than they're telling you about the state of the science, because the state of the science, in light of the data that are available thus far, is open to a broad latitude of interpretation. Now, is it an unmitigated disaster? I would say I haven't seen evidence for that yet. That would be my answer for that. Second, okay, so there's now, thus far, this is great. This is great. We owe people like Leif and Brian and others a huge debt of gratitude. We're having an enormously constructive conversation about research practices in the field. As long as we are able to continue hearing each other, as long as we're able to have constructive dialogue about these things, and sometimes I worry that there are cases where we actually start to close off. This is a review I got, and if it's one of you guys, I'm sorry, I'm going to leave this anonymous, but I got this review recently where, remember I said earlier that I thought that that false positive psychology paper is absolutely ingenious as trenchant satire, but that I don't think it's some sort of statement about what's actually happening in the field. It's assumptions about how people behave. And so my co-authors and I thought, there would be real value in getting deeper into what exactly is it? How exactly are people p-hacking? How were they p-hacking in 2010 as best they can remember? And so we tried to get some information. This is a review that we got back. Now you guys can help me interpret this, and maybe if the reviewer's here, you can help me interpret this. Although I appreciate the intent of the PIs, their planned contribution seems fundamentally flawed. In a manner that reflects a common attitude among psychologists, they seem to believe that the foundational issues are empirical ones that can and should be assessed with experiments. The intuitive arguments of Simmons et al. And others were convincing precisely because nearly everyone realized that they were doing some of these questionable research practices. Am I right or wrong in interpreting this to mean we don't need any data to address this, that we all know the answer and data should not be brought to bear? Can anybody come up with a different meaning? And that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is, yes, everybody agrees in some. Everybody agrees that a strict alpha of 0.05, we're fooling ourselves. To deny that is an ostrich behavior. But how much we're deviating from 0.05? Is it 0.61? Is it 0.07? Maybe everybody p-hacked 0.07. And that's a problem, but it's not a catastrophic problem, arguably. If they're p-hacking 0.61, we've got a different set of problems, right? So I feel like, boy, it would be good to know this stuff. Please, can we bring data to bear on these issues? And this isn't the only case. I'm going to give you just one other example of places where I've been alarmed by the unwillingness to allow data to speak to the debates that we're having, the meta-theoretical debates. In other words, to adjudicate the meta-meta-theoretical debates. I'm not kidding, that's what it's called. Okay, so here's an open data controversy. So this is Twitter. I understand, let's just say we all know what Twitter is. So a neuroscientist at Berkeley tweets the following: sigh, a paper we've been working on for 1.5 years was just scooped by another lab that reanalyzed open data from my lab. Oh well. And I said this. I retweeted it and said, a sad story that requires serious consideration as we sprint toward open data, time to consider possible costs. And the first reaction to that was actually quite legitimate, I thought, which was cost for who? Science only benefited. This shows we should cooperate more and have less individualism. But can we agree that this is an empirical question, right? Can we all agree that that's a hypothesis, that yes, this guy and maybe his first author graduate student, worked for a year and a half on a paper, and that got scooped. And maybe that's better for science that this other paper got published instead. Okay, that's a reasonable hypothesis. Can we also grant my alternative hypothesis that there might have been something to be said for letting that initial lab actually work through its publication plan over some number of years before it becomes a free-for-all for the data? This is a great important question as we think about the future of the field. But then things, I think, went haywire. So I asked, so I think I continue to believe that we're engaging with ideas and open to data and so forth. Even if we don't care about the scholar who did the work and got scooped, was science best served in this case? It's plausible that allowing the initial researcher to complete his or her publication vision would have been better. And then I felt like I entered the twilight zone. So can you give me some more details about what happened before this becomes ammunition for the anti-open science crowd? Sorry, so I should show this. So apparently there's an anti-open science crowd. I might be leading it, and perhaps I'm even fomenting the anti-open science thing with my gnarly question asking. So Jack Gallant says, just to be clear, the scoopers did nothing wrong. They cited our data in papers. They asked a simpler question for which the old data was okay. But of course, everybody understood that's what they did. That's exactly what we said was going to happen in our paper that was published previously. If anybody wants to see an overview of our perspective on this stuff, this is a JPSP from 2015 with Eastwick and Rees, where we said, of course, this is what's going to happen. If we make data free for everybody to use early in a research program, then that initial author will be scooped with her own data. This is the process as it is meant to work. Are we happy with how it's working? Reasonable question. But again, let's stay in the twilight zone here. So no smoking gun for now. There's a movement. It's not just an anti-open science crowd. Apparently I am leading, or if somebody else is leading it, sign me up. An anti-open science movement, and we're first waiting for the first real scoop. But can we be fair, right? I didn't make up the word scoop. The person got scooped. He himself posted it. And what did I do to warrant this anti-open science movement fomenting ship? I asked that question, right? These are empirical questions. These are worth considering seriously. So my question is this. In principle, could data be brought to bear on this debate, or have issues surrounding open practices become sacred values in and of themselves, that is, autonomous from the implications of those practices for scientific quality? In other words, has the means become the end? I thought we were all fighting to get the best science that we can, but maybe we're not. Maybe I'm fighting to get the best science that we can, but some people have declared some means of that as being much more sacred than that end, and maybe I'm mistaken. And I'm reminded of this, by the way. Let me be very clear. I'm not accusing anybody of being a Democrat or Republican. I'm just giving an example of what I perceive to be going on in those sorts of twilight zone cases I just showed you. Why are all these Republicans in 2012 raising their hands? Well, they're raising their hands in response to this. Raise your hand if you feel so strongly about not raising taxes that you'd walk away on the 10-to-1 deal. So those of you who pay attention to American politics might remember that there was sequester fever, there was budget fever sweeping the nation in 2010, 11, 12. And so Republicans very much prize deficit reduction. Let's balance the budget. This is ridiculous. We need to spend within our means. But there's, of course, two different means of balancing the budget. There is reducing how much you spend and increasing how much you bring in, i.e. taxes. But when they're confronted with what seems to be a very lopsided deal in their favor, they refuse it, right? They don't say, wow, $10 of spending reduction for $1 of tax increase, I'm in because that favors my side so strongly. They say, I would never consider it. And I think the fair way to characterize the way these particular 8 people thought about the issue in 2012, or at least presented themselves to voters in 2012, is taxation. Raising taxes is now functionally autonomous from balancing budgets. It is no longer a story about budget. They no longer really care about budget deficit reduction. What they really care about is taxation. Okay, fine. That's fine. Let's just call it what it is. Okay. Third, and finally, where from here, right? So I've given an overview that I think says, boy, there's a lot of latitude. Is it catastrophically broken? Is it mostly okay? Is it somewhere in the middle? Probably the last of those. And I've talked a little bit about places where I worry that some of us, and I'm not claiming I'm not ideological, you and I and everybody else, we're biased in our own ways. We have to work really hard on ourselves not to become so morally immersed in our own views. So where can we go from here? I think I want to give a very obvious point and say, boy, these conversations would be more constructive and less upsetting if we were better at listening to each other. All of us, I'm not excluding myself, all of us could work on this. So one issue is that it's hard to listen when we feel so dismissive of the people who disagree with us, and I'm once again going to show this this blog post. I don't actually know the intent behind this part, but perhaps more upsetting than the real problems facing my beloved social psychology is the level of denial I see. And you can see at the bottom here that denial has to stop. Now, I don't know to whom he's talking, but I would actually say to him, you say it's festering with rot, and I say there's no evidence for that. And he would say I'm in denial, or maybe he wouldn't. I don't know exactly what he would say, but you can see how it starts to become us versus them, these very polarizing sorts of discussions. Too many of us are willing to employ nuclear options when non-nuclear options are available. So many of us are familiar that at least one member of our beloved community has been going around North America, giving talks, putting images of social psychologists next to images of Lance Armstrong and saying, these are dopers and cheaters, right? Like, these aren't people who are accused of fraud, right? These are mainstream people that have been accused of no wrongdoing other than post hoc power suggesting that they probably either p-hacked or file droid some stuff, right? I'm not saying that's benign, I'm not saying that's nothing, I'm just saying it's pretty mainstream among a lot of us. And does this seem like a reasonable way to go about this? You could make the case that the answer is yes, because you could say, well, if public shaming gets severe enough, then people will stop doing those practices. I have some objections there. By the way, just to make sure I'm being, at least trying to make an effort to be more balanced here, I also don't love this accusations of bullying stuff, right? So on the other side of these discussions, there are cases surely where some replicators might have behaved in a slightly gloating manner, but look, let's face the fact. People who are engaging in replications are doing a massive service to the field. They should not be worried that above and beyond spending their precious resources and their precious time trying to replicate something for the field, that then afterward when they try to share the results, assuming they do it in a reasonable way and assuming they had reasonable motives about the replication, that they're going to be called bullies, right? Like, we should all be allowed to contribute to these sorts of discussions and without actually going nuclear on each other. Okay, let's try to think about a possibility of a more nuanced trade-off based dialogue in the field. So we argued in this 2015 piece that in fact the evidentiary value movement has two potential threads in it, and we argued that the dominant thread is the false positive reduction approach. In fact, we initially called this the anti-false positive movement, and I'm grateful to Brian actually for clarifying that that's not a fair characterization. There's a broader movement about evidentiary value, but in my reading, the dominant theme, why most published research findings are false positive psychology, is in the reduction of false positive errors, right? We suggest that there's an error balance way of thinking about these things. That is, many of the ways that we could reduce the rate of false positives will simply escalate the publication threshold, right? So now you need 5 times as many people, but you still need just as many studies and just as much mechanism evidence, and it's just harder and harder and harder to publish. That is, the standards of the threshold gets higher and higher. If we do that, which is maybe a reasonable thing to do, I'm open-minded to that, we should all acknowledge that we are now leaving true findings that would have been published 5 years ago on the cutting room floor. That is outside of the realm of the journal articles. Maybe it's just on OSF or something, but it's outside of the most mainstream ways of thinking about those things. In fact, that's a trade-off. Basically, we are under many circumstances trading off false positives for false negatives. And I don't have a real preference about what that ratio should be, but I'd love for everybody to engage seriously with that idea. So this is the last time I'll bring up the blog. So more than a little afraid of what I would discover, I analyzed my research output using all 3 of the above metrics. These are all 3 very new metrics. I'm impressed with all of them, but they are very new. We don't know the final word on them. P-curve, R-index, and TIVA. And I decided to separately examine my first 10 empirical papers and then my last 10 empirical papers to see if my research output has increased in scientific quality. Now, when and how did such metrics become equivalent to scientific quality? Now again, this guy is an incredibly bright, nuanced thinker, so I don't actually think he meant that things like theoretical innovation and methodological rigor are totally meaningless. But there is in my feeling, there is on both sides, on all sides of these debates, there is a tendency to get encamped in our worldview and make us insensitive to some rather extreme assumptions that we make, not through bad motives, but just through worldview, right? Science is about a lot more than this, right? All of us want high evidentiary value to our science. That involves discovery and validity. It involves a true relative to false positives. We don't have to worry about that. Okay, true rather than false positives, but Jesus. But also we want true rather than false negatives, right? And again, my view is that we haven't really seen much in the way of emphasis on false negatives, and I sort of presented that evidence there. But in reality, there's all sorts of things that we value as a science. There are all sorts of means that we want to pursue toward the ends of a science with high evidentiary value. And to the degree that we don't consider all of our proposals in light of these various means, we're likely to commit something that I'm calling trade-off neglect. So the open data example we talked about earlier runs the risk, we talk about this in our JPSP paper, of undermining methodological ambition, right? So how highly incentivized will it be to run these enormously labor-intensive studies if the moment you're done collecting it, everybody has access to your data, or the moment you publish your first finding? Like, I would probably do different sorts of work if I were subject to that. Another example, we really increasingly value large N and close replication. I totally agree with both of those things, but we haven't had very much discussion about how that affects resource use, about how many different sorts of new questions we can ask. If your view is that the field is a rotting corpse, then maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's like, well, just give me one true finding. But if it's like, yeah, we're discovering some stuff and some stuff is valid and yeah, we can improve, then there's a real discussion to have about what is the optimal use of the various resources that we have in the field. Here's another one. We've jettisoned that Daryl Bem chapter about how to write an empirical journal article, and with some reasonably good reason. It turns out that harking is much more destructive than we realized, even than he realized, I think. We were trained to hark. But Jesus, what does a research report look like if literally you're describing every single thing? Now maybe there's some very simple research reports where this doesn't become incredibly cumbersome, but anyway, it seems like it is not simple to write a compelling scientific report and simultaneously be reporting, and then I moved my finger, I'm exaggerating, right? But like every single thing that you did, like there's gonna be a trade-off here. How do we navigate that trade-off? All right, conclusion. The evidentiary value movement affords us a tremendous opportunity to evaluate our research practices and work toward optimizing the quality of our science. Second, aside from fraud, all research practices have trade-offs, so all of us need to avoid the temptation to view our own favored means as a sacred end in itself. At least that's my view. And then finally, there are lots of ideas about the best way for us to bolster the quality of our science, and it's important that all of us try to listen to each other's ideas, even if we initially agree with them, and assuming goodwill from the other side or the person you disagree with is going to go a long way toward benefiting the quality of our science. Thank you very much. Hey.
For the emphasis on listening and keeping the dialogue going, and even the caricatures are helpful, I think, in sort of evaluating what's happening in the field. So in the vein of listening to each other, I guess I love your perspective and the perspective in the paper of let's listen to the data, right? Like, we're all scientists, let's do that. And as scientists, we're probably pretty hesitant to make any recommendations about things, before we have all the data and it leads to clear conclusions. But where it gets hard is, we're still all conducting science, and so it's sort of tough to know exactly where to go from here in our own science practices. Whereas, Brian gives these very clear recommendations of be transparent, do this, do that. So from your perspective, where does the data say we're at, and what are some concrete things we can do as researchers to get to good quality science without maybe
yeah.
overreacting?
So I think to paraphrase this question, it's like, all right, so maybe it'll take 100 years for us to totally hammer these things out. We'll be dead, and what do we do in the meantime? This is an excellent question, and I don't. And you might want to get a job at some point either. Yeah, it's easy for tenured professors to pontificate about this stuff, and I'm always cognizant of that. Well, my view is, so I'm not going to offer prescriptive. So let me talk for me in my lab. We didn't know in 2012 the role that small sample sizes play in type 1 error. We always knew that small sample sizes were problematic for type 2 error, but we didn't really have, it took Leif for us really to understand p-hacking, researcher degrees of freedoms. I knew about bouncing betas, but didn't think well about them. And so for me, we run, whenever possible, much larger studies on the order of 2 to 3 to 4 times the size that we used to run before. So I guess I would say that isn't a general answer to your question, but it is a principle that we've tried to adopt, which is listen to the developments in the movement. Don't get overly swayed by any one person making any one sort of claim. Try to evaluate soberly what is the overall corpus of evidence. Ideally, you're listening to people from all sides of the discussion, and then to say, that's really persuasive. Like, I'm going to be somewhat better on that. And that is what we've tried to do. Our practices are significantly different. I believe them to be better. Time will tell. But they're significantly different than they were in 2012 because I am listening. Does that mean that I buy what I perceive to be the strong forms of some of the, like, everything should be pre-registered? I mean, Brian and I disagree about that. I think pre-registration is a terrific tool, and I'm totally convinced that any hypothesis test derived from a fully pre-registered study is more convincing than any hypothesis test not. I'm totally convinced by that. There's then judgment about the degree to which that's true, and I see downsides of pre-registration that haven't been discussed. So I guess I would say the principle is listen, learn, and improve.
So, Eli, you said a couple of things that I can easily identify with, but it's hard for me to reconcile them. So one was that we should be listening to the data about this. So a lot of the questions about improvements in the field are empirical ones, and so we should assess the data and determine, which ones are best, and what evidence you actually care about. But at the same time, you also talked about how there is a lot of data, and there are many ways to interpret it. Okay, so we could look at the results of the reproducibility project, and we can interpret it this way or that way. We could look at QRPs, and we can interpret it this way or that way. And so I'm it's hard for me to know how to do both of those things, and I'm a little bit worried that if we say, well, even if we have a ton of data, and if we don't know how to interpret it, the result will be, okay, well, if I don't know what to make of this, then I'm just going to do everything the same way that I have.
If you get a paper to review that says, we studied people's research or degrees of freedom, don't say data are irrelevant. That's the first step. Like, don't review like that reviewer is, I think, the first step. I don't have an easy answer. I totally agree with you that look, the fact is this revolution, if we date it from Leif's paper, is under 5 years old. I mean, it's like staggeringly successful, and we are looking and trying to make sense of it from the eye of the hurricane. And so I don't think we have firm answers. I think really the underlying theme of my talk is an exhortation against extremism. It's basically like, we're learning a lot. This is a great thing for science. And before we throw out everything old and overhaul it with everything new, there may be some costs and trade-offs we haven't thought and collateral damage of those decisions. That doesn't answer your question, but it's, again, like a principled way of thinking about these issues. Samin?
Yeah, I really appreciate you talking about this. A lot of really good stuff and thought-provoking stuff. One thing that made me think, I hadn't really thought about this much before, except the idea that there's this trade-off between type 1 and type 2 error. We talked before, I talked with Chris and other people about how one exception to that rule is that increasing samples reduces type 2 error indirectly reduces the proportion of type 1 error in the literature. So that's nice, but I think more generally, I would hope that we would focus on changes and improvements that would shrink confidence intervals. And anything that shrinks confidence intervals, I think, gets away from this trade-off between reducing type 1 and type 2 error. That if we shrink confidence intervals, we get more precise estimates, we require more conclusiveness before we draw strong conclusions. That helps avoid this trade-off between type 1 and type 2 error.
There's all sorts of trade-offs. So I agree with you that, okay, so two things. One is I'm defining type 2 error broadly. Klaus Fiedler did this first, but type 2 error not only in the old statistical sense, but also in the sense of true things that never make it to publication. That is, things that are true that we as a field don't know, I'm treating as a form of type 2 error. The second thing is shrinking confidence intervals is terrific, but we can't claim that it doesn't come with trade-offs. So one way to do it is, like, I can run 5 million people in my next study and have an absolutely minuscule, or let me be more realistic, 1,000, right, people in my next study. But maybe I could have run 200 in that study, had like what I perceive to be a negligibly larger confidence interval, and run 4 more studies. So I guess I would say all of these things involve trade-offs. In terms of the type 1, type 2 trade-off, which is one variation of trade-offs, yes, that is, shrinking confidence intervals is great. Any mechanism that you would use to shrink confidence intervals would have collateral damage. Do I have time for one more? Yep.
So, back on that question, the best way to shrink type 1 and type 2 error is such a run of people. Like with relationship studies, that's just not practical to do a replication of that takes 10 years. Could an alternative be just to collect like 50% more participants than you want? Take those 50%, randomly select like a third of the people, test everything you want to test on that third, so that's your training set, and then test to see if all that replicates on the rest of the 2/3 of the participants?
You for sure could. You for sure could, but of course you're now dealing with a much smaller sample than with this first one. You're dealing with a much smaller sample than you actually have, so your betas will be bouncier than they necessarily have to be, and probably more unreliable, so that when you turn to your confirmatory test, you are now testing probably less reliable exploratory findings on a much smaller sample with less power. This is not to criticize my overarching theme is trade-offs, right? This is a good idea. I think it's reasonable. By the way, I don't think it's always reasonable to say just run 50% more marriage studies in your 4-year longitudinal. I mean, that could be many tens of thousands of dollars in logistical hell. But the principle is a very good one, and these sorts of, you mentioned something like this too, these sorts of solution to the sorts of problems are good. Please talk about them as we weigh policy or practice. Please talk about them within the context of collateral damage, trade-offs, potential downsides. Yes. Oh, sorry. Great. It would have been great. I love what your question was going to be. Daryl Bem, 2016.